December 1944. A destroyed village chapel near Bastogne, Belgium. Heavy snow falls through the shattered wooden rafters of a roof that no longer exists. The air is 20 degrees below zero. Inside, a lone man kneels on the frozen stone floor before a broken crucifix hanging sideways on a scarred stone wall. He wears a heavy wool overcoat, with no rank insignia visible in the dark. He is completely alone. No cameras capture the moment. No staff officers stand at attention. No reporters wait outside. The silence of the ruined sanctuary is broken only by the distant, muffled thud of artillery fire shaking the snow from the pine trees a few miles away. Outside the arched doorway, a lone aide watches from the shadows, frozen in place. He realizes he is witnessing what the general did when no one was watching. This is the story of what General George S. Patton did, alone in a destroyed chapel on Christmas Eve 1944 when no one was watching. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. Captain Charles Codman was 46 years old, from Boston, Massachusetts, serving directly as the personal aide-de-camp to the commander of the 3rd United States Army. Before the war broke out, he had been an elegant wine connoisseur and a cultured businessman, but the realities of combat quickly stripped away any lingering notions of romantic military adventure. He had seen the charred remains of American armored columns outside Casablanca, and he had buried close friends in the rocky, unforgiving soil of Sicily. The heavy burden of his daily duties was tracking the soaring casualty reports that arrived at the headquarters every morning, a grim task that constantly reminded him of the human cost behind every tactical decision. On this freezing Christmas Eve, he noticed the sudden absence of his commanding officer from the packed briefing room and felt an immediate, pressing obligation to locate him before the midnight reports arrived. Major General Robert Troy was 52 years old, born in Washington, District of Columbia, and served as a high-ranking staff logistics officer who operated out of a secure, well-heated chateau miles behind the active front lines. He believed firmly that senior officers were an elite class meant to preserve their energy and analytical detachment, far removed from the emotional mud and misery of the common infantryman. His pristine uniform lacked a single speck of dirt. His leather boots shone with a fresh coat of polish, and he frequently enjoyed hot coffee poured from a silver pot while men froze in the Ardennes. Troy openly maintained that individual soldiers were merely replaceable numbers on a ledger, and he had spent his evening complaining bitterly about the lack of fresh poultry for his staff dinner. He viewed the entire rescue operation toward Bastogne as a reckless gamble that disrupted his carefully organized supply schedules and put his personal comfort at risk. The Allied advance across Western Europe had ground to a sudden and bloody halt during the final weeks of 1944. The German military had launched a massive, unexpected counteroffensive through the dense, snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, catching the thinly stretched American lines completely by surprise. A critical junction of roads centered around the small Belgian town of Bastogne was now completely surrounded by hostile forces, leaving the thousands of trapped American paratroopers short on ammunition, medical supplies, and winter clothing. The weather remained bitterly cold, with thick fog preventing the Allied air forces from dropping supplies or providing tactical support to the desperate men fighting on the frozen ground. In the chaotic scramble to respond to this sudden breakthrough, several high-ranking officers behind the front lines openly questioned whether the position could even be held at all. Many commanders in the rear echelons had allowed their administrative routines to slide into a state of defensive paralysis, focusing entirely on micromanaging their own retreats rather than organizing immediate support. Supply lines were thoroughly choked with retreating vehicles. Communication networks were repeatedly severed by enemy saboteurs, and a general sense of panic threatened to stall any coordinated counterattack. While administrative officers argued over protocol and resource allocations in warm offices, the infantrymen in the foxholes were quite literally freezing to death in the woods. Other leaders had simply let the chaos dictate their actions, refusing to take responsibility for the logistical gridlock that left forward units isolated without food, winter gear, or heavy artillery support. The entire rescue mission depended entirely on shifting an entire field army north in the dead of winter, a feat that standard military doctrine considered absolutely impossible under such extreme weather conditions. The breakdown in cooperation between forward combat elements and the rear line logistics staff had reached a breaking point on Christmas Eve. Captain Codman entered the heated logistics office to find Major General Troy sitting near a large iron stove. The room smelled of roasting meat and fresh coffee. Codman held a stack of urgent requests from the front lines. He placed the papers directly on the map table. "We need 20,000 gallons of fuel shifted to the forward tanks immediately, General," Codman said. Troy did not look up from his coffee cup. "That fuel is allocated for the scheduled withdrawal of the heavy repair echelons next week. The paratroopers in Bastogne are completely surrounded and running out of ammunition," Codman said. "They need our armor to break through the southern perimeter by morning." "My schedules are set by corporate military doctrine," Troy answered. "I will not compromise the safety of my entire logistical apparatus for a localized tactical crisis. The orders come directly from 3rd Army headquarters to advance at all costs," Codman said. "The men are freezing to death in their foxholes right now." Troy stood up slowly and adjusted his pristine wool jacket. "Let them freeze. The common infantryman is a replaceable asset in a global war of attrition. My administrative staff represents the true brain of this army. I am not risking our vehicles in a winter blizzard because some frontline officers failed to hold their ground. This is not a matter of choice or administrative convenience, General," Codman said. "It is an explicit operational directive." Troy laughed and turned back to the stove. "You tell your flamboyant commander that I answer to the supply ledger, not to theatrical gestures. If the frontline units die in the snow, the Pentagon will simply ship us new ones next month. I am staying right here in this warm chateau." Codman pulled the paperwork back off the table. "I will inform the command post of your specific position on this matter, General." "Do whatever you please," Troy said. "My comfort and my schedule remain exactly as they are." The aide walked out into the freezing night. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His jeep pulled up to the gate of the chateau, the 4 stars on his helmet gleaming under the dim blackout lights. The ivory revolvers rested on his belt. He walked into the warm room unannounced, his wool coat covered in wet snow. Everyone in the room immediately stood at attention, freezing in place. Patton did not raise his voice. His eyes locked onto the logistics officer. "Are you Major General Robert Troy?" Patton asked. "I am, General," Troy said. "Did you receive an operational directive from my headquarters to shift 20,000 gallons of fuel north to the relief columns?" Patton asked. "I did," Troy said. "But I was explaining to your aide that my localized logistical schedules make that adjustment highly inefficient." "Did you state that the frontline infantrymen are merely replaceable assets in a global war of attrition?" Patton asked. Troy cleared his throat and adjusted his collar. "General, we must maintain administrative detachment to win a war of this scale. The numbers simply do not support risking our rear assets." Patton studied him. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. "You sit here by a warm stove, while men are dying in the forest. You talk about numbers and ledgers because your skin is safe behind these thick stone walls. You believe your administrative comfort is more valuable than the lives of the soldiers who are holding the line with their bare hands. The men in Bastogne are not numbers on a sheet of paper. They are American soldiers who have been ordered to hold a vital junction, and they are doing it without blankets, without artillery shells, and without complaint. Every hour you delay your trucks is an hour they spend freezing in the dark. Your tailored uniform and your polished boots do not make you an elite class. They make you a parasite living off the blood of better men who are bleeding into the Belgian snow. An army does not exist to serve your administrative convenience. Your entire apparatus exists solely to put ammunition and fuel into the hands of the men who are fighting the enemy. You have a choice. You will personally lead the first fuel convoy north into the freezing blizzard within the next 10 minutes. Or you will be stripped of your rank and placed in a forward rifle platoon before midnight. Decide now. Troy looked at the cold face of the commander, his arrogance completely shattered. He slowly reached for his winter cap. The order was carried out within 10 minutes. Major General Troy walked out into the swirling white blizzard, his leather boots sinking into the thick snow as he climbed into the unheated cabin of the lead truck. The heavy diesel engines roared to life, coughing thick black smoke into the freezing night air. The convoy crawled forward onto the icy road, heading north toward the surrounded town. The headlights masked to narrow slits. Troy sat stiffly behind the frost-covered windshield, his hands shivering inside his wool gloves as the sub-zero wind cut through the gaps in the doorframe. He could smell the sharp tang of exhaust and frozen oil. Along the route, groups of exhausted combat engineers and passing ambulance drivers stopped to watch the unexpected column pass. They saw a high-ranking logistics officer sitting in the front seat of a cargo vehicle, surrounded by fuel barrels, navigating the treacherous roads under direct tactical pressure. The sight of a rear echelon commander driving through the frozen darkness signaled to every witness that the entire army was moving. The column pushed deeper into the Ardennes forest, carrying the necessary fuel to the waiting lines before the break of dawn. Captain Codman returned to Boston after the war ended, resuming his civilian life as a wine merchant and corporate executive. He lived quietly in Massachusetts, rarely discussing the brutal winter of the Ardennes with his neighbors or business associates. He passed away in 1954, leaving behind a private diary that remained tucked away in an old leather trunk for decades before his family discovered it. The handwritten entries contained the only surviving eyewitness account of the events that transpired in the ruined sanctuary on that frozen winter night. Major General Troy faced an administrative review board following the conclusion of European hostilities regarding his logistics management. He left active military service in 1947, spending his remaining years in a comfortable home outside Washington, where he wrote extensive memoirs defending his rigid adherence to administrative supply doctrine. He died in 1968, bitter about the rapid changes in mechanized warfare, and convinced that modern operational methods ignored the proper military hierarchy. He never acknowledged the validity of the operational emergency that forced him onto the road to Bastogne. General Patton never mentioned the destroyed village chapel in his official reports, or spoke about his midnight prayer to the war correspondents covering the Third Army headquarters. He kept his deep personal anxieties regarding his men completely hidden behind his public persona of absolute confidence and theatrical bravado. He wrote a brief entry in his private diary before going to sleep that morning, stating simply that the attack would proceed at dawn as scheduled. Some historians have argued that Patton's private religious devotion was a calculated extension of his theatrical command style, designed to project an image of divine destiny to his staff and the press. They suggest that his dramatic displays of faith were carefully timed to boost morale during critical operational setbacks, when standard tactical maneuvers were failing. Others argue the opposite, maintaining that his personal prayer life was entirely genuine and served as his only source of psychological relief from the crushing moral weight of sending thousands of young men to their deaths. What is certain is that the relief of Bastogne remains one of the most remarkable logistical and tactical achievements of the entire war. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have offered a softer alternative to the logistics officer? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.